to day 2 of our World War II unit. Today we're going to talk through the expansion of the war over in Europe and in the Pacific, and also going to talk a little bit about Pearl Harbor. And that will be the end of today's video. It will be fairly short. Have fun! Hello. Today I'm going to talk to you about the beginning of World War II and some of the events that led up to it. We don't unfortunately have enough time to get into great detail about how Hitler came to power and the promises that he made. We've touched on some of them. I'll bring a few up, but you're going to get kind of the shortened version here, and you can certainly do a little more research and find out more if you would like. So once Hitler is in power, we see Germany starting to expand, and there's some warning signs here that the rest of the world either didn't want to see or, kind of chose to avoid in an effort to prevent the war. And that time period is going to be called appeasement, and I'll show you that on the next slide. So the first thing we're going to talk about is March 7th, 1936. German troops occupy the Rhineland. That's an area along the border of France and Germany by the Rhine River, and it was supposed to be demilitarized, and so it was German territory, but it could not have any German troops in it. And this speaks to how paranoid France was that Germany might invade it again someday. And on March 7th, 1936, Hitler sent troops in there under the premise that the Germanic-speaking people there needed protection. And he's going to use that concept of needing protection on a couple of occasions here. On March 12th and 13th, 1938, Germany announced the Anschluss, or union, with Austria, in which Austria became annexed and officially part of Germany. Again, most of the world looked at this, didn't think it was that big of a deal. Certainly there were some people who did, but Hitler himself is Austrian. He is not German. He joined the German army in World War I, really kind of associated himself as a German, and now he could make himself a German by simply making Austria part of Germany. October 15th, 1938, German troops occupied the Sudetenland. That was a border region around Czechoslovakia. It also had Germanic-speaking people in it. The Czech government had seen what Hitler had done previously with occupying the Rhineland, essentially taking control of Austria, and they wanted everybody in the world to know that they did not welcome the German troops there. And as a result, they actually resigned. And European countries will meet with Hitler, specifically France and Great Britain, and in the end, in March 15th, 16th, 1939, not quite a year later, the Nazis will take all of Czechoslovakia. When this happens, it prompts the European countries again to come to a meeting. That first meeting, they more or less sold out Czechoslovakia, right? Hitler promised he would never do something like this again, that he was only doing it to, protect the Germanic people. And, when he takes all of Czechoslovakia, Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England, has a meeting with Hitler and expresses his concerns about what Hitler is doing. And eventually Neville Chamberlain finishes the meeting, comes back to England, steps off the plane, and has a really famous quote. And he says, "There will be peace in our time." And this is really important because it talks about the mindset of these European countries. And I know I'm kind of putting England in charge of everybody's mindset here, but the reality of it is they were all thinking the same. Hitler was promising he would never do something like this again. They're all attempting to avoid war. And when he says there will be peace in our time, really Hitler has just fooled him. And on September 1st, 1939, really only a few months later, the Nazis invaded Poland. And at that point, it's World War II in Europe. Not for the United States yet, but it is in Europe. So they have open hostilities. The British will declare war on Germany. as part of a pact to protect Poland. And oddly enough, on the opposite side of Poland, the Soviet Union invaded. And at this time, the Nazis and the Soviet Union had a treaty or an alliance with each other, and they split up Poland. This alliance was only meant to fool the Soviets. The Germans had every intention of eventually invading the Soviet Union, but Stalin didn't see that one coming. That time period was known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, and eventually Germany is going to turn all of their attention towards the Soviet Union in something known as Operation Barbarossa, in which they will invade the Soviet Union. All right, there's appeasement. That was what I was talking about. It was a policy of loosening restrictions on Germany in hopes of avoiding war. Most European countries didn't want to go to war anymore. They had suffered enough during World War I, and so they were trying to do anything they could to avoid it. And as a result, they allowed Hitler to, more or less openly defy the Treaty of Versailles, built back up his military, started taking territory. They had become very, very modern in their military because most of it had been scrapped after World War I, so they had to start all over. As a result, Germany has this massive modern military. France also felt a false sense of security behind the Maginot Line, which was a series of forts and fortifications all along the French and German border. They proudly proclaimed that no country would ever be able to break through it, and they were right. The Germans just went around it. And then we have isolationism in the United States. The U.S. public is more concerned with what is going on in our own country because obviously we're dealing with the Great Depression. And so we really had wanted to shut it down after World War I, and we're not concerned about what was going on in Europe. Japanese were also expanding during this time. During the 1930s, Japan began expanding across Asia. Their goal was to create this greater East Asia sphere, kind of their influence, and they wanted to push out all white or Western influence from Asia and more or less have it for themselves. On the surface, it sounded like they were trying to, eliminate Western influence and return Asia to Asians, but they really weren't. They were taking it for themselves. They took the entire Korea Peninsula, most of the coastal cities in China, and kind of the coal-producing area of Manchuria, and they were expanding all along in the South Pacific. After Germany attacked in Europe, Japan struck British and French colonies in the Pacific and Asia, continuing their expansion, and they also moved into French Indochina. Their thinking was that the British and French were too occupied with Germany in Europe, and so that these colonies were kind of ripe for the taking, and they were. The United States at this time told the Japanese to stop their expansion and withdraw from China or face embargoes, and that was a big deal because the United States was Japan's major supplier of oil, and without their supply of oil, Japan, their military, would literally shut down. And so they would have to get oil from another source. And they know where there is another source. It's the Dutch East Indies. The problem is, between Japan and the Dutch East Indies is a huge American colony known as the Philippines. And so they have no intention of stopping their expansion, so they're going to have to somehow secure another source of oil. And they know they can take the Dutch East Indies, but they're afraid that if the American colony on the Philippines is still there, they will always be able to use, they being the Americans, their fleet to stop the flow of oil to Japan. So Hideki Tojo, who was the Prime Minister of Japan, told the Japanese Navy to prepare a plan of attack against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. They want to find a way to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet for at least 6 months so that they can capture the Philippines and therefore secure their oil pipeline. Admiral Yamamoto is in charge of the Japanese naval force sent to attack Pearl Harbor. He had actually trained in the United States for a few years. He was a pretty intelligent military commander. and he set forth the plan of attack. So, why December 7th? Why did the Japanese choose this date? And what advantage does this date offer the Japanese? I'll give you a clue on this because this is your first open-ended question you'll have to answer. Don't get hung up on the date, but instead take a look at the day. The day of the week offered the Japanese an advantage. What did they need to do in order to win? I already kind of told you that. They had to cripple or destroy the American fleet for at least 6 months so that they could capture the Philippines. Now, they also wanted to make sure that they destroyed the American aircraft carriers, which about the only lucky thing that happened on December 7th for us was that the aircraft carriers were not there. And a Japanese spy near Pearl Harbor had reported that they were. He had mistakenly identified a few refueling ships as the aircraft carriers, where the Japanese would not have attacked that day, so they thought they were there. And then how will this attack be beneficial for the Japanese? Again, think about that oil and trying to get the oil from the Dutch East Indies, which they don't have yet, but they're going to capture after this attack, and being able to get that oil to Japan. The picture you see there on the right is a mini sub. There were, depending upon who you listen to, 4 or 5 Japanese mini subs that attempted to get into Pearl Harbor that day. One washed ashore. A couple of them were destroyed and never found. This one here was shot by the USS Ward just outside of the entrance to Pearl Harbor. There's your first open-ended question. I see a video up there on the right. You can watch that video. It's a very detailed account of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It lasts about 15 or 16 minutes. You don't have to watch it, but certainly it'll give you a little bit more insight. December 8th, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. President Roosevelt declared that day a day that will live in infamy. On December 11th, 1941, Germany declares war on the U.S., and I think we talked about that before. It's kind of ironic. The only country in the world that Germany declared war on was the United States. Italy did the same, and that is kind of the major alliance, Japan, Italy, and Germany. They made up the Axis powers. There are a few other smaller countries that'll join them later, but they're really kind of insignificant in the war, with the exception maybe of Finland. And Finland doesn't necessarily join the Axis powers because they're, aligned with the Nazi or the Japanese ideology. They just really didn't like the Russians very much. All right, there's a period known as the dark days of the war. So almost immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked the Philippines. That battle lasts until May of 1942. The United States military could not resupply our soldiers on the Philippines because our fleet was so devastated during the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so ultimately, they were literally stuck on an island as the Japanese military continued to pour into the Philippines. And it resulted in the largest surrender of U.S. soldiers in the history of the U.S. military. Never had it before or since. This surrender leads to kind of an infamous moment known as the Bataan Death March. All right, so on the old PowerPoint here that I kind of uploaded in here, I had it linked right here, but on the Nearpod, it will show up on the next slide. But it is a firsthand account from a soldier from the Company C of the 194th Tank Battalion. And he's from Salinas, California, but other members of that Company C, 194th Tank Battalion, were from Brainerd, Minnesota. So kind of a local connection. Each year in Brainerd, there is a Bataan Death March Memorial Run Walk in the city of Brainerd to kind of commemorate what those guys went through. The Bataan Death March does a ton to show us the brutality of the Japanese. There were over 10,000 American soldiers on this Bataan Death March. There's 70,000, 80,000 Filipino soldiers. And to kind of sum it up, essentially, if you fell down, they killed you. And they didn't really feed anybody, and they didn't really give them water. And it was a brutal, brutal march. And so, to be perfectly honest with you, the video is kind of sad. You can tell that even though he's quite old, he's still kind of traumatized by what he saw. But again, it's really good to show you the brutality of the Japanese, and then to bring forward the concept that U.S. soldiers will not surrender to the Japanese again, and the Japanese won't surrender to us, which makes the war in the Pacific very brutal. All right, so you just click on that link there. Again, the video only takes about 15 minutes or so. All right, that's where we're going to stop.